When my stepdad's hand connected with my face that December night, I never imagined those 5 seconds would lead to me standing in a Siberian labor camp 6 weeks later, learning to survive on frozen potatoes and determination. I'm Janet Linkletter, and I was 29 years old when my life exploded. After my divorce, I'd moved back to Charlotte, North Carolina, thinking it would be temporary. Just a few months with Mom and her husband Roger while I got back on my feet. That was my first mistake. Roger Brennan had married my mother when I was 15. For 14 years, we'd maintained a cold peace. He tolerated me as his wife's baggage, and I tolerated him as the man who made Mom happy. But when I moved back home, something shifted. Maybe it was having an adult stepdaughter in his space. Maybe it was his business failing while I still had my office manager job. Or maybe it was what happened with Grandma's will. My grandmother Rose passed away that October, leaving me $50,000. Not life-changing money, but enough to restart after my divorce. Roger found out about it when Mom accidentally mentioned it during dinner. I watched his face change, like a calculator starting up behind his eyes. The campaign started subtly. Comments about family sacrifice, how tough times meant everyone needed to contribute, how Grandma would have wanted the money to help the whole family. Mom stayed quiet during these discussions, stirring her mashed potatoes like they contained the secrets of the universe. 3 weeks before Christmas, Roger stopped being subtle. He'd drawn up papers transferring the inheritance to a family account he controlled. For home repairs, he said. For Mom's medical bills. For their retirement. He pushed the papers across the kitchen table with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by women in his house. I pushed them back. The veins in his neck started their little dance. Roger had a temper, but it usually came out in slammed doors and muttered curses. This time was different. This time, when I said the money was mine and I needed it to start over, something snapped. His hand moved so fast I didn't see it coming. The slap knocked me sideways, my cheek burning like I'd pressed it against a stovetop. Mom gasped, but didn't move. And Roger, breathing hard, said those words that would change everything. "You're going to Russia. Don't call or come over, we're done." I laughed, thinking it was just angry nonsense. But Roger's import business had connections everywhere, including Eastern Europe. Turns out, when you know the right people and have the right paperwork, you can make someone disappear legally. Within 48 hours, I had a work visa I never applied for, a plane ticket I never bought, and a contract with a fish processing plant in Siberia that I never signed. Roger had a judge friend who'd helped with some creative paperwork. My signature was forged, but who was I going to complain to? Roger made it clear I could go voluntarily or he could make my life hell with fraud charges for the loans he'd taken out in my name. Loans I didn't even know existed yet. Mom drove me to the airport. She hugged me at departures and whispered she was sorry, but Roger was going through a tough time. His business was struggling. He didn't mean it. He'd calm down and I could come home in a few months. I wanted to shake her, scream that she was choosing him over her own daughter. Instead, I walked through security with one suitcase and a phone that would be useless where I was going. The flight to Moscow was 11 hours of disbelief. This wasn't happening. This was America. You couldn't just ship someone to Siberia like some old Russian joke. But when I landed, and a stern woman holding a sign with my name gestured for me to follow, reality hit harder than Roger's hand. The domestic flight to Novosibirsk was on a plane that seemed held together by prayer and duct tape. The Russian businessman next to me took one look at my North Face jacket and laughed. He said something in Russian that I'd later learn meant tourist funeral clothes. My college Russian classes hadn't prepared me for actual Russians. At Novosibirsk airport, a van was waiting. The driver, a man who looked like he'd been carved from permafrost, loaded my suitcase without a word. 5 other workers climbed in, 2 Filipino women, 1 Ukrainian man, and 2 women from Kyrgyzstan. We looked at each other with the hollow eyes of people who'd made bad deals or had bad luck. The drive to Kolodny took 8 hours through white nothing, just snow, darkness, and occasional clusters of lights that might have been towns or gulags for all I knew. The heater in the van worked in theory, but not practice. I learned later that minus 40 degrees Celsius and minus 40 Fahrenheit are the same number. The only temperature where both systems agree. This is too cold for human life. When we finally arrived, my new home was a concrete block that looked like it had lost a fight with the 1960s. The apartment was on the 4th floor, no elevator. 6 women, 3 rooms, 1 bathroom. The kitchen had a 2-burner stove and a refrigerator that was redundant since the whole place felt like the inside of one. My roommates looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. The American girl who somehow ended up here. Svetlana, a woman from Moldova who'd been there 2 years, showed me my bed, a narrow cot in a room with 2 others. She pointed to a nail in the wall. That was my closet. That first night, lying under a blanket that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, I thought about Roger's face when he hit me, the satisfaction in his eyes. He thought he'd won, gotten rid of the problem, kept the money that would probably come to him if I disappeared. What he didn't know was that he just enrolled me in the world's harshest finishing school. Before we continue, please subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time is it there. I see everything. Thank you so much for your support. My first morning in Kolodny, I woke up at 4 a.m. to someone screaming. Turns out it was just Galina from Kazakhstan trying to kill a cockroach the size of a small mouse. In Siberia, even the bugs are tougher. The cockroach won. We named him Boris and accepted him as a 7th roommate. The fish processing plant was a 20-minute walk through snow that came up to my knees. My North Face jacket, which cost me $300 at REI, might as well have been made of paper towels. The other workers wore what looked like sleeping bags with arms. Later, Olga, my supervisor, would take pity on me and give me her dead husband's old Soviet military coat. It smelled like cigarettes and sadness, but it was the warmest thing I'd ever worn. The plant itself was a cathedral of misery. Imagine a warehouse where the concept of heat had been abolished, filled with conveyor belts of frozen fish that needed to be sorted, cleaned, and packed. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. My hands cracked and bled within the first 3 days. The smell, God, the smell. It wasn't just fish. It was the smell of industrial refrigeration, cheap disinfectant, and despair, all mixed into something that invaded your dreams. Olga was 60 years old and had hands like leather gloves. She'd been working there since the Soviet times, she told me, when at least they pretended to care about workers. She took one look at me that first day, this soft American girl trying not to cry, and decided I was her project. She taught me to wrap my hands in plastic bags before putting on the work gloves. She showed me how to stand so my back wouldn't break after 8 hours. She even taught me the real Russian curse words, not the polite ones from my college textbooks. The language barrier was brutal. My university Russian was useless here. I'd learned to say things like, I would like to discuss Russian literature and where is the museum? Nobody in Kolodny wanted to discuss Tolstoy, and the closest thing to a museum was the abandoned Soviet community center with propaganda posters still on the walls. I learned real Russian. My hands are frozen, the toilet is broken again, and is this meat or fish? Hot water was a luxury that happened twice a week, Tuesday and Saturday, for 2 hours. You had to plan your life around it. 6 women, 1 bathroom, 2 hours of hot water. It was like a military operation. We had schedules, timers, and strict 5-minute limits. I learned to wash my hair in water so cold it gave me brain freeze, and to be grateful for those 2 weekly moments of warmth. The food situation was its own adventure. The company's store sold basics. Black bread that could double as a weapon, potatoes that were more ice than vegetable, and mysterious canned goods with labels that had faded sometime during Brezhnev's era. Meat was for payday. Vegetables were for summer. Fruit was for dreams. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It's solid. You can build on it. After 2 weeks of crying into my frozen pillow, something shifted. Maybe it was Olga sharing her lunch with me. Thick soup that tasted like heaven, even though I suspected it was mostly potato water and hope. Maybe it was Svetlana teaching me to play Russian card games while we waited for the hot water. Or maybe it was pure spite against Roger. Sitting warm in Charlotte, thinking he'd beaten me, I started learning. Really learning. Not just the language, but the system. How to trade shifts for favors. Which foreman would look the other way if you needed an extra break. How vodka wasn't just alcohol here. It was social security, medical insurance, and currency all in one. You didn't drink it all. You save those little bottles like gold coins. My first attempt at romance was with Dmitri, one of the truck drivers who delivered supplies. He had kind eyes and all his teeth, which made him a catch by Kolodny standards. He spoke a little English, told me about his dreams of Moscow, promised he could get us both there. For 3 weeks, I thought I'd found my ticket out. Then payday came, and Dmitri disappeared with not just his money, but also the 5,000 rubles I'd saved. The other girls weren't surprised. Apparently, Dmitri did this every few months when new foreign workers arrived. It was like a seasonal migration pattern. I wanted to report him. But to whom? The police chief was Dmitri's cousin. The plant manager was his drinking buddy. This wasn't America where you could call corporate HR and file a complaint. This was Siberia, where justice was as frozen as everything else. The humiliation burned worse than the cold, but Olga just shrugged and said something that translates roughly to, "Men are wolves, but we are winter." I didn't understand it then, but I would. 3 months in, I'd changed. My hands were calloused, but they'd stopped bleeding. I could gut and clean a fish in 30 seconds. I knew which babushka sold the best pickled cabbage at the Sunday market. I could drink vodka without gasping. And most importantly, I discovered something interesting about our plant manager, Viktor Petrovich. Viktor Petrovich was skimming wages, and he wasn't even clever about it. My office manager brain couldn't help but notice the patterns. We were supposed to get paid for 12-hour shifts, but the official records showed 10. Overtime was promised but never appeared. Safety equipment deductions for equipment that didn't exist. Classic schemes, but sloppily executed. Back in Charlotte, I'd handled payroll for a company of 200 people. I knew every trick in the book and how to spot them. Victor didn't know that. To him, I was just another desperate American who'd ended up in his frozen kingdom. But I started documenting everything, times, dates, amounts. I made friends with Natasha from accounting, a lonely woman who appreciated having someone to eat lunch with. She didn't know she was showing me evidence when she complained about the paperwork. The turning point came when I realized Victor wasn't just stealing from us. He was stealing from the company owners in Moscow. Double billing for supplies, phantom employees, the whole works. In America, this would be FBI territory. In Russia, this was Tuesday, but it was also leverage. I spent a month preparing my case. Documentation, photos, even a recording of Victor bragging about his scheme while drunk at the plant's New Year party. Russians love their New Year celebrations, and Victor loved his vodka. The combination was beautiful for my purposes. When I confronted him, I did it smart, not threatening, just a friendly conversation about how difficult it must be to manage such a complex operation, how easy it would be for someone to misunderstand the discrepancies, how Moscow might not appreciate the creativity in bookkeeping. Victor's face went through more colors than a Siberian sunset. The negotiation was quick. He could transfer me to Moscow. He had connections there. A cousin with a cleaning service that needed English-speaking workers for international offices, or I could have a terrible accident with the fish grinding machine. I took Moscow, obviously, but I also took copies of everything. Insurance, Olga called it when I told her. She hugged me goodbye and gave me a plastic bag full of pickled vegetables for the journey. In Siberia, that's love. The Trans-Siberian Railway from Novosibirsk to Moscow takes 3 days. 3 days in a train compartment with 3 other people, watching Russia roll by like an endless movie about snow and birch trees. My compartment mates were a grandmother taking her grandson to university and a businessman who sold car parts. We drank tea from the samovar, played cards, and shared food. The grandmother, Lyudmila, took one look at my Soviet military coat and knew my story without asking. She'd seen too many girls like me, foreign, desperate, learning Russia the hard way. She taught me things during that journey, not language or culture, but survival. How to spot a good person from a bad one by their shoes. How to hide money in 5 different places on your body. How to make friends with babushkas because they know everything and everyone. The businessman, Sergey, was different. He wanted to practice his English, told me about the new Russia, the one that was modern and full of opportunity. He gave me his card, Said if Moscow didn't work out, his company always needed translators. I kept that card like a talisman. Watching Russia pass by the window was hypnotic. Villages that looked unchanged since Tolstoy's time. Cities that sprouted Soviet apartment blocks like concrete mushrooms. Stations where people sold everything from fur hats to homemade jam through the train windows. It was a country that couldn't decide what century it wanted to live in. The funny thing about Russian trains is that they break down time. You're in this bubble where strangers become temporary family. You share food, stories, silence. The businessman told me about his divorce, how his wife left him for an Italian she met online. The grandmother talked about surviving the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and money became worthless overnight. And I told them about Roger, about the slap, about the fish plant. They weren't shocked. Russians have seen worse. As we got closer to Moscow, something shifted in the air. The villages got bigger, the stations got fancier, and my compartment mates got quieter. Moscow wasn't just another city to them. It was the beast that ate their children, the golden promise that usually turned to brass. Lyudmila pressed a small icon into my hand as we pulled into the station. For protection, she said. From what? She didn't specify. Moscow hit me like a slap. Ironically appropriate. The station was massive, gorgeous, intimidating. People moved with purpose, dressed in clothes that cost more than I'd made in 3 months. The smell was different too. Exhaust fumes and expensive perfume instead of fish and industrial disinfectant. I'd gone from black and white Kansas to Technicolor Oz if Oz was built by oligarchs and decorated by someone with a gold fetish. Victor's cousin, Mikhail, met me at the station. He looked me up and down, clearly disappointed by the Siberian refugee in front of him, but a deal was a deal. The cleaning service, it turned out, was legitimate. They had contracts with international companies, embassies, rich people who wanted their toilets cleaned by someone who wouldn't steal or gossip in Russian. My new accommodation was a hostel in the outskirts, 40 minutes by metro from the center. 8 women to a room, which was actually an improvement from Kolodny. My roommates were from Ukraine, Moldova, Tajikistan, the former Soviet United Nations of economic refugees. We all had the same story with different details. Bad luck, bad men, or bad timing had brought us to Moscow to clean up after people who earned in a day what we made in a month. But Moscow was possibility. You could taste it in the air, see it in the Bentleys parked next to beat-up Lotus, feel it in the energy that never stopped. This wasn't Siberia where hope went to freeze. This was Moscow where anything could happen, and usually did. My first day cleaning offices in Moscow's financial district was like entering another dimension. These weren't just offices. They were kingdoms of glass and chrome where people younger than me were making millions moving numbers on screens. I'd clean their desks at night, see the champagne bottles in the trash, the receipts for dinners that cost more than my monthly salary. But the real shock was the contrast. Outside these towers, babushkas sold pickles from buckets on the street corners. The metro was full of people who looked exhausted by 7 a.m. The city was schizophrenic, obscene wealth next to grinding poverty, and everyone pretending this was normal. My break came when one of the executives, Natalia Volkonsky, heard me answering a phone in English at reception while the regular girl was sick. My American accent was like finding a unicorn in Moscow. Within a week, I was teaching English to her twin boys, Pavel and Pyotr, age 13. The pay was 5 times what I made cleaning. The catch? I had to live in their guest house and be available whenever the boys needed help with homework. The Volkonsky estate in Rubliovka was insane. The guest house was bigger than any home I'd lived in. The main house was like something from a magazine about how Russian oligarchs live. Indoor pool, cinema room, a kitchen that could service a restaurant. The boys had everything. Private school, tutors for every subject, horses, skiing trips to Switzerland. They were also desperately lonely and surprisingly sweet. Their older brother, Alexander, was 24 and worked in his father's energy company. He looked like every American woman's fantasy of a Russian man. Tall, cheekbones that could cut glass, eyes like a winter sky. He was also smooth as aged vodka and twice as dangerous. The seduction was gradual. Coffee in the morning while I prepared lessons, conversations about America, about books, about life. He'd lived in London for university, Spoke perfect English with just enough accent to be charming. He brought me gifts. Nothing too obvious, just books he thought I'd like. Chocolates from Belgium, a scarf because mine was clearly not warm enough for Moscow winters. I fell for it like an idiot. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the romance of it all. Or maybe it was just nice to be wanted by someone who wasn't paying me to clean or teach. For 3 months, I thought I was living in a Russian fairy tale. Secret meetings when his parents traveled. Whispered promises about the future. Even talk of visiting America together. The fairy tale ended at a party for Russian Unity Day. The Volkonskys threw a massive celebration. Hundreds of guests. Enough caviar to feed a small city. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Alexander insisted. Gave me a dress that cost more than I'd ever held. I felt like Cinderella if Cinderella was an English teacher from North Carolina, pretending she belonged with Moscow's elite. The accusation came at midnight. Madame Volkonsky's diamond bracelet was missing. Security was checking everyone. And somehow, I still don't know how, it was found in my room in the guest house. I hadn't taken it. Hadn't even seen it before that moment. But who was going to believe the American help over Moscow royalty? Alexander's face when they accused me told me everything. Not surprise, not defense, just mild disappointment that the party was being disrupted. He'd known, maybe even planned it. I was becoming inconvenient, asking too many questions about our future, and this was the Moscow way of ending things. They didn't call the police. That would have been too much scandal. But I was fired immediately, blacklisted from the agency, and given 24 hours to leave the guest house. The boys, Pavel and Pyotr, hugged me goodbye while crying, which almost broke me. They didn't understand why their favorite teacher was suddenly a thief. I spent that night in a 24-hour cafe near Belaruskaya station, drinking tea and planning my next move. My phone had one number I hadn't called, Marina, a girl from my university Russian class who'd moved to St. Petersburg after graduation. We hadn't talked in years, but desperate times and all that. She answered on the third ring, heard the tears in my voice, and said to get on the next train. I know this seems crazy, but it gets even wilder. If you're still with me, hit that like button. It really helps me share these stories. The train to St. Petersburg was a blur of shame and anger. 7 hours to think about how stupid I'd been. Alexander had played me like a balalaika, and I danced to every note. But underneath the humiliation was something else, education. Moscow had taught me that in Russia, everyone's running a game. The trick was knowing which game you're in. St. Petersburg's Moskovsky station was different from Moscow immediately. Less gold, more gray, less energy, more elegance. If Moscow was new money shouting, Petersburg was old culture whispering. I called Marina from the station. The number was disconnected. The address she'd given me years ago led to a pharmacy. The pharmacy owner had never heard of her. So there I was, standing on Nevsky Prospect with a suitcase and dwindling rubles, in a city where I knew nobody. But you know what? After Siberia and Moscow, this didn't even rate in my top 5 disasters. I found a hostel near the Fontanka River, run by a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Chekhov play, all tragic eyes and cigarette smoke. Finding work was easier than expected. St. Petersburg survives on tourism, and American English speakers who actually showed up sober were apparently rare. Within 3 days, I was waitressing at a restaurant called the Bronze Horseman that served overpriced borscht to cruise ship tourists. The owner, Grigory, was a former submarine captain who'd learned English from bootleg American movies. His favorite phrase was, "Make it happen, baby," which he used for everything from taking orders to fixing the toilet. The communal apartment came next. In Petersburg, they call them kommunalkas, Soviet-era apartments divided into rooms with shared kitchens and bathrooms. Mine had 6 rooms, 12 people, and 1 cat who owned the place more than any of us. My roommates included a philosophy student who dealt drugs to survive, a ballet dancer who'd aged out of the Mariinsky, and a programmer who was definitely doing something illegal online, but politely. Petersburg revealed itself slowly, like a suspicious friend. The white nights in summer when the sun never fully set and the whole city went slightly mad. The drawbridges that opened at night, trapping you on whatever island you'd chosen for the evening. The casual way people mentioned surviving the siege of Leningrad like it was yesterday, not 1942. History wasn't passed here, It was your drinking buddy. The restaurant was where I met Mikhail the artist. Not Moscow Mikhail. Petersburg had its own collection of Mikhails, Alexanders, and Sergeys. Like Russia had a limited supply of male names, this Mikhail painted tourists on Palace Square for money and real art in his basement studio. For his soul, he had paint under his fingernails and revolution in his eyes. The romance was different this time. Slower, more careful. We walked along the embankments talking about art, America, the future of Russia. He painted me 17 times, called the series American Sadness. I wasn't sad, I told him. He said all Americans were sad. They just didn't know it yet because they had too much comfort. Russians knew their sadness intimately, introduced it at parties, made it pay rent. For 4 months, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe Petersburg was where I'd stay, with this complicated artist in this complicated city. I was saving money, learning the city's rhythms, even starting to understand Russian fatalism. Then Mikhail got an offer, an art residency in Berlin, sponsored by a German woman who'd bought his paintings and maybe wanted to buy him too. He left on a Tuesday, promised to send for me, classic Russian romance novel stuff. I knew he was lying. He knew I knew, but we played the scene anyway. Petersburg had taught me that sometimes the performance is more important than the truth. It's a city built on a swamp by a madman. Everything here is about preferring the beautiful lie. But here's what changed. I didn't collapse, didn't cry into my pillow or plan dramatic revenge. Instead, I went to work, served overpriced soup to Americans from Iowa, and started really planning. Not revenge exactly, but something bigger. I was going to go home, but not as the same Janet who'd been slapped into submission. I was going home as someone who'd survived Siberian winter and Moscow's gold fever and Petersburg's beautiful deceptions. 1 year in Russia total, and I'd become someone I didn't recognize in the mirror. My Russian was fluent now, but more importantly, I understood Russian thinking. In America, we believe in fair play and systems working. In Russia, systems are suggestions, and fairness is what you create for yourself. It wasn't cynical, it was practical. My side hustle started accidentally. An American couple at the restaurant couldn't figure out how to register their visa at the migration office. I offered to help for $50. What should have taken them 3 days of bureaucratic hell took me 3 hours. Word spread through the tourist network. Soon I was the American who could navigate Russian paperwork, find apartments that actually existed, explain why you needed to bribe the doctor for a medical certificate even though you weren't sick. The funny thing about helping other foreigners was seeing myself a year ago in their confused faces. They'd arrive thinking Russia was just cold America with different letters. Then they'd discover that addresses didn't work like they expected, that yes could mean no, depending on intonation, that you needed 3 stamps for everything, but the stamps were in 3 different buildings that were only open on alternating Tuesdays. I built a network without meaning to. There was Anya, who worked at the migration office and appreciated American chocolate. Boris, the landlord, who had apartments that weren't advertised. Katya at the medical clinic, who could expedite anything for a bottle of good cognac. Even Vadim, a taxi driver who became my personal FSB conspiracy theorist and city guide. He was convinced America was controlling the weather, but he liked me anyway because I laughed at his jokes. The education went beyond survival tricks. I learned about Soviet history from people who'd lived it. My Kommunalka neighbor, the aged-out ballerina Irina, told me about dancing through the collapse of the USSR, performing Swan Lake while the government dissolved. The philosophy student dealer, Kostya, explained Russian fatalism through Dostoevsky while measuring out weed on a kitchen scale. Even Grigory at the restaurant had stories about being underwater in a nuclear submarine, playing chess to stay sane. Russians taught me about resilience differently than Americans understand it. We think resilience is bouncing back, returning to normal. Russians know normal is an illusion. Resilience is adapting to whatever insanity comes next, finding humor in the absurdity, and always having a backup plan for your backup plan. I was making decent money now. The restaurant, the foreign assistant side gig, even some translation work for a sketchy import company that definitely wasn't importing what they claimed. My savings grew. hidden in 3 different places because I'd learned from the Dmitry disaster. Never keep all your eggs in one basket, especially when the basket is in Russia. The news from home came through Facebook. Roger's import business was failing. Mom was sick. Nothing specific in her posts, just vague mentions of doctor visits and prayer requests. Their house was for sale. Part of me felt satisfaction. Karma, the Russians would say, always comes. Just sometimes it takes the scenic route through Siberia. But another part, a part that surprised me, felt something else. Not sympathy exactly, but a weird distance from the rage that had kept me warm through Siberian nights. Maybe it was Petersburg's melancholy influence, or maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying all that anger. It was heavy, and I was tired. The joke about garage sales still makes me laugh. I tried explaining the concept to my Kommunalka neighbors. Americans put their unwanted stuff on their lawn, and strangers come by it. They looked at me like I was describing ritual sacrifice. Why would you let strangers know what you have? Why sell things for less than they're worth? Why not just give them to friends? The cultural gap was beautiful. Then they tried explaining dakas to me. These summer houses where Russians grow their own food and pretend to be farmers on weekends. Now, who's weird? My skill set by this point was ridiculous. I could spot a scam in 3 languages, negotiate with bureaucrats who hadn't smiled since 1987, drink vodka like water without dying, navigate 3 different cities' metro systems, and make friends with babushkas who treated me like their wayward granddaughter. I could also gut a fish in 30 seconds, but I tried not to put that on my mental resume. The plan forming in my head wasn't about simple revenge anymore. It was about something bigger. Roger had tried to destroy me by sending me here, but instead he'd given me an education you couldn't get at Harvard. I understood systems, both how they worked and how they failed. I understood people, what they wanted, and what they'd do to get it. Most importantly, I understood myself. I wasn't the Janet who'd moved back home after a divorce, defeated and dependent. I was someone who'd survived Russian winter and Russian bureaucracy, which might be the same thing. But first, I needed more ammunition. Through my sketchy import company connections, I learned something interesting. Roger's failing business had been trying to establish Russian connections for years. He'd been scammed 3 times by fake partners, lost hundreds of thousands. He was desperate for someone who actually understood how Russian business worked. The irony was delicious, like good caviar you eat while laughing. I started researching from Petersburg's surprisingly good public library. Roger's loans in my name. I had the account numbers now, thanks to a credit report I'd managed to get through the one American bank with a Moscow office. The fraud was extensive and sloppy. He'd been counting on me never coming back, never checking. But I was coming back, and I was bringing all of Russia's lessons with me. 18 months in Russia, and my bank account had $15,000 in it. Not a fortune, but considering I'd arrived with nothing and survived Siberian slave wages, it felt like winning the lottery. The money was split between 3 banks, 2 countries, and some of it was literally buried in a tin can in Vadim's mother's garden. You can take the girl out of Russia, but Russian paranoia about banks stays with you forever. The discovery about Roger using my social security number came from an unexpected source. Marina, my college friend who'd ghosted me in Petersburg, finally surfaced on Facebook. She was in London now, married to an investment banker, living the life Instagram was invented for. But she felt guilty about the disappearing act and wanted to help. Her husband ran a credit check on me as a favor. The results were a masterpiece of identity theft. Roger had taken out loans totaling $200,000 in my name. Business loans, personal loans, even a mortgage on a property in Florida I'd never seen. My credit score was somewhere between disaster and why are you even checking? The rage that had been cooling in Petersburg's chill came roaring back like a Siberian blizzard. But this wasn't Siberian Janet who would have cried, or Moscow Janet who would have schemed for petty revenge. This was Petersburg Janet, who understood that the best revenge is served not cold, but with documentation and legal precedent. I started gathering evidence with the methodical patience of a Russian grandmother, pickling cabbage for winter. The opportunity came like a gift from the vodka gods. Roger was coming to Moscow for the International Import-Export Exhibition, his last desperate attempt to save his business by finding Russian partners. He'd posted about it on LinkedIn, the idiot, complete with his hotel information and meeting schedule. Professional social media, where middle-aged men go to destroy themselves publicly. I had 3 weeks to prepare. I took time off from the restaurant telling Grigory I had family business. He poured me a vodka, told me to give them hell, baby, and didn't ask questions. That's the thing about Russians. They understand that sometimes you have to handle things, and they respect the necessity. The train from Petersburg to Moscow felt different this time. I wasn't running to something or from something. I was hunting. My documentation was organized like a legal brief. Screenshots, account numbers, dates, amounts. I'd even managed to get copies of the loan applications through a connection at one of the banks. Turns out, Russian bank security is mostly theoretical if you know which security guard needs money for his kids' school fees. Moscow looked smaller somehow, less intimidating, more manageable. I knew its rhythms now, its pressure points. I got a hostel near the exhibition center, the same hostel where I'd stayed after the Volkonsky disaster. The owner recognized me, raised an eyebrow at my improved Russian and clothes, but said nothing. Moscow respects transformation. The exhibition was at the Expo Center. A Soviet-era monstrosity that looked like a spaceship had mated with a warehouse. I bought a day pass as a translator, which cost half my monthly restaurant salary but was worth it for access. And there he was, Roger Brennan, looking 10 years older and 20 pounds heavier, sweating through his American suit while trying to impress Russians who were clearly playing with him like cats with a mouse. I watched him for 2 hours. Watched him fumble basic Russian greetings, watched him trust the obviously fake smiles, watched him hand out business cards like he was feeding pigeons. He was so far out of his depth he couldn't even see the surface. Part of me almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The Russians he was meeting were textbook scammers. I recognized the type from my sketchy import company connections. They promised him everything, showed him fake certificates, probably had a bridge to sell him too. One of them I actually knew, Alexei from my Moscow days, who'd tried to sell me an investment opportunity that was definitely a pyramid scheme. Small world, smaller scammer community. I could have warned Roger, could have saved him from losing whatever money he had left. Instead, I took photos, documentation of him meeting with known criminals because Alexei had a record for fraud. Evidence that would be useful later, when I needed to prove Roger's business connections were dirty. But then something unexpected happened. I overheard Roger on a phone call with Mom. He was practically crying, begging her to hang on, promising he'd fix everything, saying therapy was helping and he was different now. He mentioned AA, anger management, even church counseling. Roger, who hadn't been to church since his wedding, talking about finding God. The call ended with him saying he'd find me, make it right, bring me home, that he knew he'd destroyed everything but was trying to rebuild, that Mom wouldn't take him back until he fixed what he'd done to me. The broken sound in his voice was something I'd never heard before. Roger had always been granite, hard, cold, immovable. This was granite crumbling. I followed him back to his hotel, still not sure what I was going to do. Confront him? Destroy him? Both? Neither? In the hotel bar, he sat alone, nursing a water, not even a beer. He looked defeated in a way that Siberian winter hadn't defeated me, in a way that went deeper than money or business failure. Then he pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. I moved closer, pretending to look for someone. On his screen were photos of me, from Facebook, from Mom's phone, even my college graduation. He was staring at them like they were evidence of a crime he'd committed, which I guess they were. The next morning, I decided to stop stalking and start confronting, but not at the exhibition. Too many people, too much chaos. I sent him a message from a throwaway email. Meet me at the cafe in Guem at 2 p.m. We need to talk about your Russian problem. Guem was the fancy shopping center on Red Square, public enough to be safe, private enough for real conversation. He walked into that cafe like a man walking to his execution. His eyes scanned the crowd, probably expecting some Russian thug or business rival. When he saw me, his face went through every emotion in the human catalog: shock, disbelief, fear, shame, and something that looked dangerously close to relief. I'd practiced this moment for months, had whole speeches prepared about justice and consequences. Instead, what came out was, "Hello, Roger, you look terrible." He laughed, actually laughed, and it wasn't mean or dismissive. It was the laugh of someone who'd hit bottom so hard they'd bounced. "Janet, Jesus Christ, Janet, you look different." Different was an understatement. 18 months of Russia had rewritten my DNA. I was harder, sharper, speaking English now with the slight rhythm of someone who'd been thinking in Russian. But more than that, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. He was just a broken man in a bad suit, sweating in a Moscow cafe. The story poured out of him like a confession. After I left, Mom had found out about the loans, the fraud, all of it. She'd left him, moved in with her sister. His business had been failing even before that, but without Mom, he'd completely fallen apart. The drinking got worse until he wrecked his car into a mailbox and got arrested for DUI. The court-mandated therapy, AA, the whole program. But here's what got me. He actually did it. Not just showed up, but really did the work. The therapist, he said, helped him understand that his father had beaten him the same way, that he was just continuing the cycle. The AA sponsor made him list everyone he'd hurt. I was at the top, circled 3 times. The anger management taught him that his rage was really fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of being seen as weak, fear of losing control. He'd been trying to find me for 6 months, hired a private investigator who traced me to Moscow but lost the trail. He'd been saving money to pay back the fraudulent loans, had already cleared 2 of them. The house sale would cover the rest. He showed me documents, bank statements, everything. It was all real, or the best forgery I'd ever seen. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. And for once, Roger was telling the truth. "I just needed you to know that I know what I did, and I'm trying to be better. Your mom won't even talk to me until I make this right." The cafe around us was full of tourists taking photos, Russians arguing about politics, normal life happening while my world tilted on its axis. The Roger I'd hated was gone, replaced by this smaller, sadder, more human version. It was disturbing, like finding out your monster was just a man in a costume the whole time. I told him about Siberia, every detail, the cold, the factory, the desperation. His face got paler with each word. When I got to the part about Dmitri stealing my money, he actually stood up like he was going to go find the guy right then. Old Roger habits, but with different motivation. Moscow was easier to hear about, but when I described Alexander's betrayal, Roger's jaw clenched in a way I recognized. "Men who hurt women," he said quietly, "are the lowest form of life." I should know. I was one. The revelation that I'd been surviving, even thriving in some ways, seemed to both relieve and hurt him, like he was proud of my strength, but ashamed it had been necessary. When I told him about my side business helping foreigners, he actually smiled. "You always were smarter than me," he said. I just couldn't stand it. The question hung between us. What now? I had my evidence, my proof of his crimes. I could destroy him legally, publicly, completely, or I could do what he'd never done for me. Show mercy. The power felt strange, uncomfortable. I understood why Russians preferred chess to checkers. The game was more complex when your opponent could become your ally. "I need to think," I told him, standing to leave. He grabbed my wrist, not hard, just desperate. The old Janet would have flinched. Russian Janet just looked at him steadily until he let go. "I have a return flight tomorrow," he said, "but I can change it. If you need more time, if you want to talk more, I'll stay." That night, I walked through Moscow thinking about cycles and breaking them. Roger's father had hit him, so Roger hit me. Roger sent me to Russia, and Russia had beaten me into something stronger. But if I destroyed Roger now, what was I continuing? What cycle was I feeding? I called Mom from a park bench near the Kremlin. It was early morning in Charlotte. She cried when she heard my voice, really sobbed in a way that made my chest hurt. She told me everything, finding the loan documents, confronting Roger, the divorce papers she'd filed but hadn't served yet. She was waiting, she said, to see if he could become the man she'd thought she'd married. "He's different, Janet," she said, and I could hear the hope and fear fighting in her voice. But different doesn't always mean better. I need to know you're okay before I can even think about anything else. I wasn't okay. I was magnificent and destroyed, educated and traumatized, stronger and more fragile than I'd ever been. Russia had made me into a nesting doll, multiple versions of myself, each one containing the others. But I was alive, and I was choosing what came next, and maybe that was the definition of okay. The next morning, I met Roger for breakfast. He looked like he hadn't slept, which made two of us. I'd made my decision at about 4 a.m., staring at the ceiling of my hostel bunk, listening to someone snore in Portuguese. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, pulling out my documentation. "You're going to pay back every loan, every penny, with interest. You're going to clear my credit completely. You're going to write a letter to the credit bureaus explaining the fraud was entirely your doing, and you're going to pay for my flight home when I'm ready to come." He nodded at each point. No argument, no negotiation. The old Roger would have tried to bargain, make excuses. This Roger just took notes. "And," I continued, "you're going to help me start my business. Not with money, I don't want your money, but with connections, introductions, whatever I need to import Russian goods to North Carolina. You owe me that much." His eyes widened slightly. "You're coming home?" "Eventually, when I'm ready. And not to your home. That bridge is ash. But Charlotte is my city too. And I've learned things here that American businesses need. Russia knows how to survive anything, how to work around any system, how to find opportunity in chaos. That knowledge has value." We spent 3 hours going through the logistics. Roger, for all his faults, did know the import business. He knew the permits needed, the connections required, the mistakes to avoid. He took notes like a student, asked smart questions, and never once tried to take over the conversation. It was unsettling, like watching a lion become vegetarian. The surprise came when he pulled out a folder he'd been carrying. Inside were letters. From Mom, from my aunt, from cousins I hadn't heard from in years. They'd all written to me, not knowing where I was, hoping Roger would find me. Mom's letter was 10 pages of apology and love, and updates about neighbors and her church friends. She'd kept my room exactly the same, she wrote. Even though Roger had wanted to use it as an office, "She made me promise to give these to you in person," he said, "to make sure you actually got them." Reading Mom's handwriting broke something in me that 18 months of Russian winter hadn't touched. I cried right there in that Moscow breakfast place, ugly crying while Roger sat awkwardly, not sure if he should comfort me or run. Finally, he just pushed napkins across the table and waited. The thing about forgiveness is that it's not a gift you give someone else. It's a gift you give yourself. Permission to put down the weight you've been carrying. I'd carried Roger's slap across 3 Russian cities, through factories and restaurants and trains. I was tired of carrying it. "I don't forgive you," I told him, and watched him nod in understanding. "But I'm willing to move forward. You stay in your therapy, you keep going to AA, you treat Mom like a queen if she's crazy enough to take you back, and we can coexist peacefully, professionally. But we're never going to be family. That's more than I deserve," he said, and meant it. He left for the airport that afternoon. We shook hands at the metro station, formal and awkward. He looked older, but somehow lighter, like confession had physically removed weight from his shoulders. As his taxi pulled away, I realized I felt lighter too. The revenge I'd planned for so long would have felt good for a moment. This felt like something better, like winning a game I hadn't known I was playing. 6 months later, I stood at JFK Airport with 5 suitcases and a business plan. Roger had been true to his word. Every loan paid, credit restored, and a list of legitimate contacts in the import business who would take my calls. Mom had picked me up alone, Roger respectfully staying away, giving us space to reconnect. The reverse culture shock was brutal. American abundance felt obscene after Russian scarcity. People smiled without reason, trusted systems to work, complained about problems that Russians would consider blessings. The grocery store made me cry. So many choices, so much waste. I stood in the cereal aisle for 20 minutes, paralyzed by options, remembering Siberian black bread that could break your teeth but kept you alive. Mom had aged, but also somehow looked younger. Leaving Roger, even temporarily, had given her back something. She'd gotten a job at a dental office, her own apartment, even joined a book club that was really a wine club with literary pretensions. She was choosing to rebuild with Roger, but on her terms now. They were dating, she said, like they should have years ago, getting to know each other without the assumption of power. My business started small, a stall at the Charlotte Regional Farmers Market selling Russian goods, honey from Bashkortostan, wool socks from Siberian grandmothers who knitted like their lives depended on it. Because sometimes it did. Sea buckthorn products that Americans had never heard of but would pay premium prices for once they tried them. I knew which suppliers would actually deliver, which products would pass customs, which stories would sell to American consumers who wanted authenticity. The irony that killed me, Roger's failed contacts in Russia became my successful ones. All those Russians who'd scammed him were happy to work with someone who actually understood the game. Alexei, the pyramid scheme guy from Moscow, turned out to be a legitimate supplier of vintage Soviet posters that hipsters in Charlotte couldn't buy fast enough. Even Victor from the fish plant, once he heard I was in America and not plotting his destruction, offered to supply caviar at prices that would make me rich if I could navigate the import regulations. Within a year, I had a proper store, from Russia with lunch, selling not just products, but experiences. Russian tea ceremonies, cooking classes, even Russian conversation hours for the 3 people in Charlotte trying to learn the language. The space was small but perfect, on the edge of Noda where weird was welcome and rent wasn't insane. The grand opening was a carefully orchestrated chaos of cultures. Mom made her famous pulled pork, which we served alongside Russian salads. Vadim, my Petersburg taxi driver turned philosopher, had actually moved to Atlanta and drove down with his mother, who read palms and told fortunes with terrifying accuracy. Even some of my Siberian roommates sent video messages that we played on loop. Oh, Roger came, staying in the background, helping with setup, but not trying to claim any credit. He'd lost weight, looked healthier, and had the slightly stunned expression of someone who couldn't believe his second chance. He brought his AA sponsor, introducing me as my stepdaughter who's stronger than I ever was. It was the first time he'd called me his stepdaughter without making it sound like an insult. The surprise guest was Lyudmila, the grandmother from the Trans-Siberian Railway. She was visiting her grandson who'd graduated from Moscow University and gotten a job in Raleigh. She brought me bread and salt, the traditional Russian welcome to a new home, and cried when she saw how I'd transformed from the scared girl in the Soviet coat to this American entrepreneur who could swear fluently in Russian and knew which bribes were necessary versus optional. The business grew because I understood both sides. Americans wanted the story, the authenticity, the feeling of discovering something real. Russians wanted reliability, respect, and someone who wouldn't treat them like either criminals or curiosities. I became the bridge, translating not just language but mentality, helping American businesses understand that Russian no might mean make a better offer, and helping Russians understand that American friendliness wasn't fake, just different. The marketplace became more than a store. It was where Russian immigrants found community, where American Russophiles found their people, where curious locals discovered that Russia was more than vodka and villains in action movies. We hosted movie nights showing Soviet films with subtitles I wrote myself, explaining not just words, but context. We celebrated both American and Russian holidays, sometimes on the same day, creating beautiful cultural chaos. And yes, I kept the lessons. I still hide money in 3 places. I still assume every system might fail and have backup plans. I still drink tea like a Russian, eat pickles like medicine, and trust slowly but deeply. Siberia is in my bones now, Moscow in my ambition, Petersburg in my ability to find beauty in sadness. Roger and I developed something like a working relationship. He sent customers my way. I helped him understand the Russian contacts who weren't trying to scam him. We could sit at the same table for family dinners, though we'd never seek each other's company. Mom was happy, which mattered more than my residual anger. She'd chosen forgiveness. I'd chosen coexistence, and somehow it worked. The last scene I remember perfectly. It was a year after opening, a Thursday that felt like possibility. A young woman came in, nervous, speaking broken English with a thick Russian accent. She'd just arrived, she said. Her American husband had left her. She had nothing. I recognized the look. I'd worn it in Siberia. I made her tea, spoke to her in Russian, told her she was stronger than she knew. I gave her Anya's number at the immigration office, Boris's contact for apartments, even Vadim's information, because everyone needs a conspiracy theorist taxi driver who'll become family. As she left, clutching the paper with contacts like a lifeline, she asked why I was helping her. I thought about Roger's slap, about Siberian fish factories, about Moscow's betrayals and Petersburg's broken promises, about how the worst thing that happened to me became the education I never knew I needed. Because, I told her in Russian, winter teaches us to help each other survive. She nodded like this made perfect sense, which it did if you'd been through Russian winter. That night, I stood in my store, surrounded by Russian nesting dolls and American dreams, and realized Roger had been wrong. He'd said we were done, but we were just beginning. Siberia tried to break me. Moscow tried to buy me. Petersburg tried to fool me, but in the end, Russia just showed me who I really was. And that woman? She's unstoppable.